Leaving Gettysburg, we had a 3-hour ride down to Fredericksburg, Virginia. Our first stop would be at the Chatham Manor. Built in 1771 by William Fitzhugh, the manor provided an opulent lifestyle for many years, hosting grand parties and dignitaries such as George Washington and Thomas Jefferson. At the time of the Civil War, it was owned by the Lacey family. Prior to the Battle of Fredericksburg, it became a Union headquarters and a field hospital. Today it's the National Park headquarters, and it's shared with a small collection of displays, mostly covering the history of the manor during its glory days. Not a lot to see here, but there's a lot to read here. There's been a number of owners and renovations over the years. The grounds and the gardens are of more interest to and understanding of Chatham's role in the Civil War. From the terraces in front of the building, we can see the town of Fredericksburg sitting along the Rappaquannock River. On December 11th, 1862, Union troops bombarded the town from here and crossed the river on pontoon bridges to confront Robert E. Lee's troops. There's a replica of one of the pontoon boats here, and this was actually a prop in the film Gods and Generals. Sketch artist Henry Lovey captured the crossing for his print Forlorn Hope. It was a nasty affair with many casualties. Union troops did succeed in getting across, which led to fighting in the streets of Fredericksburg. It was the first time any American army fought in the streets from house to house. Now there's a group of catalpa trees on the side of the building. Walt Whitman came to Chatham to find his brother, who was injured in the battle. He noted that the windows behind these catalpa trees was where the surgeons worked, and piles of limbs, enough to fill a whole cart, were laying on the ground outside the windows. Apparently this is where they threw the body parts that they amputated. The trees are there today, and they are witness trees, but they are in pretty bad shape, so hopefully they'll last a little bit longer. After the war, reburial teams removed 133 Union dead from the grounds. Only 23 of them were identified. 20th century owner John Pratt discovered 3 more graves of Union soldiers. Rather than having them removed, he marked their sites, and they remain there today. On the iron fence that surrounds the grounds, you'll notice musical notes on the railing. When played, this is the melody to the song Home Sweet Home. We had a very nice picnic box lunch here before heading off to the Fredericksburg Battleground. We then went to the Fredericksburg Battlefield Visitor Center. Now there's a good number of displays and artifacts here. I thought this tube full of bullets found on the battlefield was interesting. I wanted to buy a bullet as a souvenir back in Gettysburg, but thought the cost of $8 to $20 was a little steep. There's a diorama here showing how the Union troops fought house to house in the streets of Fredericksburg once they crossed the river. They were basically out of control here, looting, pillaging homes and shops, and just being wild in the streets. Urban warfare was new to the troops on both sides, as most battles happened in the field. There's some fine artwork here by Carl Rochling, Keith Rocco, and Sidney King. The wall of civilians affected by the battle was a cool place to spend some time. Behind the photo is a short and interesting story about the person pictured. The original Sidney King landscapes that used to greet visitors to the parks were getting weather-worn and damaged. They're now replaced by those of Brian Kammerer. The birds seem to have something to say about that, but they're still stunning. Now, we were here to walk the Sunken Road, the epicenter of the battle, and one of the bloodiest defeats for the Union forces in the whole Civil War. On December 13, 1862, Union forces moved from the streets of Fredericksburg to attack the Confederate infantry positioned behind this wall and the artillery on the hills above. It was a bloodbath, resulting in 12,500 Union casualties. The wall as we see it today was restored by the CCC and a restoration contractor who actually had to come back and mess it up a little bit to make it a little bit more accurate. The restored Innes House, one of several that used to live on the road, was closed to visitors at the time, but through the window you can see the bullet-ridden walls. Union troops were slaughtered as they marched towards the wall. The ground was littered with the dead and the wounded. There is a monument here to Richard Kirkland, 2nd South Carolina Volunteers, Confederate States of America. At the risk of his own life and against orders, he went over the wall to bring water to the injured soldiers, showing compassion at death's door. He is known as the Angel of Marie's Heights. It was December, and as night fell across the battlefield, the temperature dropped. Thousands of wounded soldiers lay on the frozen, blood-stained ground as bullets whizzed over their heads. Now, there was a poem by Virginia Townsend called At Fredericksburg, written soon after the battle. Over the years, the poem has been used for many songs. One in particular called Two Soldiers, about a pair of young Union soldiers who made a pact moments before they charged into their hopeless assault, each to write to the other's mother in the event that one of them should die. Unfortunately, neither of them survived. Now, it's said that the aurora borealis filled the sky that horrible night. Some claim it was the souls leaving for a better place.
But if you ride back and I have left, you do the same for me. Mother, you know, must hear the news, so write to her tenderly. The dead who were left on the hill was the boy with the curly hair, the tall dark man who rode by his side, lay dead beside him there. There's no one to write to the blue-eyed girl the words that her lover had said. The news, and she'll only know he's dead. Mama, you know, awaits the news, and she'll only know he's dead.
Now, the Rappaquannock River became a borderline as the Union and Confederate troops wintered on either side. Now, soldiers would frequently gather at the banks to taunt and exchange sniper fire. But using what they called ferry boats, they would often exchange things that the other side wanted. The Confederates wanted coffee. The Union wanted tobacco. It is said that the military bands on both sides of the river would play songs. They were kind of having like a battle of the bands. On Christmas Eve, there was an unofficial truce where both bands and 100,000 soldiers got together and sang Home Sweet Home. I thought this painting here by Mort Kunstler called My Friend, the Enemy, just a beautiful piece that really shows the moment. Then, of course, the next morning, the battle resumed. We then headed off to Chancellorsville Battlefield and Visitor Center. Now, Chancellorsville wasn't a town. It was actually a tavern and home of George Chancellor at the intersection of the Orange Turnpike and the Orange Plank Road. During the battle, it became the headquarters of Major General Joseph Hooker. The Battle of Chancellorsville was another Union disaster and said to be Robert Lee's greatest strategic accomplishment. Union troops, however, felt that it didn't have to end in defeat. There was still plenty of fight left in the Army. The answer was that Hooker lost his nerve. The Army wasn't beaten, he was. The battle took place in an area called the Wilderness, far cry from the open fields the soldiers had been used to. Casualties were heavy, nearly 38,000, just about equally spread among Union and Confederate deaths and injured. The Union had 6,000 either missing or captured. The focus here is where Stonewall Jackson was shot and later died by his own men, a great loss for General Lee. At the Visitor Center, we are greeted with another battlefield map by artist Brian Kammerer. The Visitor Center has a lot to see. This temporary headboard of John Patterson is said to be the only surviving headboard from the 1865 burial operations, which gives you a good idea how long these bodies laid in the woods before being interred to the national cemeteries. And there are a number of great paintings by Don Troiani and the other great illustrators that we've seen all along. The story of the park and the visitor center is pretty interesting of itself. Outside the visitor center, we find a couple aluminum Happel panels named after historian Ralph Happel, who spent years researching the battlefields and interviewing veterans and local citizens. In the 1950s, the National Park Service erected these panels, and they were meant to be read from a vehicle. The National Park Service has been restoring these historical panels. The placement of the visitor center went through years of fighting between the National Park Service and various, mostly Southern, veteran groups. The key attraction here is the spot where Stonewall Jackson got shot, which in itself has been riddled with controversy. In this old picture of the first visitor center, you can see the Jackson Monument near the road, which, like the Happel panels, were placed to be viewed from your vehicle. Now, the National Park Service has done a beautiful job of restoring the landscape and improving the interpretive experience for visitors. So we took a walk out to the Jackson wounding site. This wilderness terrain was hell for the Union and for the Confederate troops, but for us it was a pleasant walk in a shaded path. Here, on the evening of May 2nd, 1863, Stonewall Jackson rode into the woods on reconnaissance, where he met Union fire. He turned back, only to be met by fire from his own troops, who thought they were firing on advancing Union troops. Jackson was hit by friendly fire and died of his wounds a week later. Now, in September of 1879, the Lacey's, formerly of Chatham Manor, now living in their summer home, Elwood Plantation, which is within the wilderness, placed a large quartz boulder here from a quarry near their home at the site where Jackson was said to be shot. But it's not actually on the spot. It was placed close to the road once again, so people would see it from their cars. In this old picture, you can see the boulder sitting alongside the orange plank road. Now, the boulder still sits along our path, but it is much smaller now, as years of relic collectors chipping away pieces of the rock have taken their toll. On top of the rock, we can see many visitors paid their respect, though I noticed that the pennies were Lincoln heads, which I thought was pretty funny. By 1887, the newly formed Stonewall Jackson Monument Association erected a more fitting monument, near the road, of course. Now, the Battle of the Wilderness in May of 1864 was another horrific engagement with nearly 30,000 casualties, 17,000 on the Union side alone. The fighting in the tangled thickets had set the brush on fire, stranding hundreds of wounded soldiers who burned to death. There was no winner. We did not stop at the wilderness site. There's not much to see there anyway, but a national park plaque, and that's about it. But this photo at the Chancellorsville Visitor Center struck a nerve with me. It's a sign that someone in the burial detail after the battle had posted, and like many, the words have since gone on to be a song.
The muffled drums and roll has been the soldier's last tattoo. No more on last parade shall meet the brave and fallen few. On fame's eternal camping ground, the silent tents are spread, and glory's God's with solemn round, the bivouac of the dead. No rumor of the foe's advance now swells upon the wind. No troubled thought at midnight haunts of loved ones left behind. No vision of the morrow's strife, though warriors dream alarms. No brazen horns, no screaming fife, at dawn shall call to arms. Rest on, sainted dead, dear as the blood you shed on fate's eternal ground. Silent tents are spread, and glory God's on solemn grounds. The bivouac of the dead.
Despite the outcome, Grant did not retreat. This was the start of Grant's offensive against Lee's armies. We then drove down the Spotsylvania battlefield, the scene of one of the bloodiest battles in the Civil War. For nearly 2 weeks, the armies fought and died with no decisive victory for either side. Again, it was simply a killing field. There were over 31,000 casualties here, the Union receiving the bulk, but the Confederate lost men they could not replace. There's no visitor center here, just a small pavilion with battle details and a few monuments in the field. So we walked out to the Bloody Angle, the site of the fiercest hand-to-hand fighting, and saw some of the fortifications and entrenchments that Lee's forces had to build. The war had changed now. Grant's overland campaign had become a Union offensive to chase down Lee, destroy his forces, and defeat the Confederacy. Spotsylvania was a costly strategic victory for Grant, driving Lee's forces to a siege at Petersburg and the eventual surrender a year later. It was a long day. We had seen a lot, and we were ready to get to our hotel in downtown Richmond, have another great meal, talk to our new friends, and get a good night's sleep. In the morning, we visited the Chimborazo Medical Museum. During the Civil War, it was the largest hospital in the world, with 7,000 beds and nearly 150 buildings. Approximately 75,000 patients passed through its doors over the course of the war. It disappeared in the early 1900s. Today, it's the site of a museum dedicated to the practice of medicine in the 1860s. It's quite extensive with a lot to see. Compared to today's standards, I thought it was pretty barbaric. kind of scary. I remember one account where soldiers said they were more afraid of being in a hospital than being on the battlefield. Throughout our tour, I couldn't help but notice how ornate the Confederate machine was compared to the Union. I thought the surgeon's kit was a little disturbing. How ornate this saw was. There was certainly nothing ornate about its use. Walt Whitman was at many of the hospitals helping both the nursing staff, the doctors, and mostly just dealing with the injured soldiers. It eventually was just too much on him, and he couldn't do it anymore. But he described the hospitals as the army of the sick in one of his later poems. From here we went to the Petersburg National Battleground and Visitor Center. The Visitor Center here is quite extensive and does a very good job explaining this complex battle with displays and artifacts. And there's a lot of Civil War art here as well by artists Don Troiani and Keith Rocco. Now, two of the soldiers' most important personal items, the canteen and the shoes, drew my immediate attention. And of course, there's the mandatory gift shop. Out front, there's an impressive display of many of the artillery used during the war and informational plaques describing their use. From here we walked out to Battery Number 5 to learn about the fortifications and the Dimmock Line. The battle for Petersburg was a 9-month siege that resembled the trench warfare of World War I. The Dimmock Line of defense was a series of 55 artillery batteries and infantry earthworks that formed a 10-mile arc around the city. Now, Grant's objective was to eliminate the supply and communication routes to Richmond. This would isolate the Confederate capital and force Lee to evacuate Richmond or fight Grant on open ground. The battle was costly, with over 8,000 Union casualties compared to about 3,200 Confederate casualties. But Lee had another problem. As many as 100 soldiers a day were deserting in face of what they thought was a lost cause. We then walked out to Fort Stedman, one of 30 forts along the Union line. It's hard to picture now what this fort must have looked like then. On the morning of March 25, 1865, Confederate forces pulled a surprise attack, overwhelming the Union defenders and capturing the fort. But it was short-lived. Union forces quickly counterattacked and recaptured the fort with heavy Confederate casualties. It was the last major assault by Lee's army, setting up the fall of Petersburg on April 2nd and 3rd. Many of the members of the 48th Pennsylvania, who were coal miners by trade, proposed tunneling into counterfeit lines, filling them with black powder and blowing a hole in the Confederate defenses. So they dug a 510-foot tunnel and loaded it with 8,000 pounds of black powder. On July 30th, 1864, they ignited it. The initial impact worked, but Union troops failed to properly execute the rest of the plan. The attack was slow, disorganized, and without leadership. Instead of going around the hole, as was planned, Union troops were led into the hole with no way to escape. So Confederate forces regrouped, firing into the pit, and it was a brutal slaughter, resulting in 4,000 Union casualties. Today there's very little to see here, just a large depression in the ground. After the war, Timothy Griffith, the owner of the land where the Battle of the Crater was fought, returned to find his farm and house destroyed. Though he worked hard to rebuild, veterans and curious tourists would trample his fields to see the crater. So he did what any good site holder would do. He charged them 25 cents to see the hole, gave tours, and sold relics, which included skulls of bodies he found on his property. The crater battlefield was on private land until 1936, when it was acquired by the National Park Service. We then went on to the Pamplin Historical Park, the Museum of the Civil War Soldier. When you go in, you choose a comrade to follow through the museum, and you grab a set of headphones, and your comrade will tell you his story as you walk through nearly 50 display stations. I chose George Washington Beetleman, who didn't really have a very active time on the battlefield. He spent most of his time sick and hospitalized, and he ended up in Harrisburg in the commissary department. Now the displays were good, and they were filled with what were supposed to be artifacts, but I had a feeling a lot of it was replicas. At each stop you would punch in the display number, and you'll hear the story of what you're looking at, as it concerns the comrade that you've chosen. Now there are two number choices here, blue if you're an adult, and yellow if you're a child. So after a while I switched to the yellow, which was somewhat educational and entertaining, but I kind of thought they were making it seem like it was fun. And there was really nothing fun about the Civil War. On the grounds is the Tudor Hall Plantation, along with various buildings that would have been on a plantation of this sort at the time of the war. The manor house had a lot of displays showing the history of the house and life on the farm. Period furnishings showed that they had a comfortable life. Though someone's got to do something about that wallpaper. I'm sorry. And what about the ghost in the mirror? There was a large slave population that worked on this land, and you can visit their simple quarters and the various workshops that kept the plantation running. Now there is an area with a replica of the Confederate fortifications around Petersburg and what the Union forces would have had to confront on their attack. So here we learn about the pioneers. These are guys armed only with a hatchet who went ahead of the assault team to clear the way of all the obstacles that were laid out in front of the fortifications. I don't know if I'd want to be one of these guys. And here too is a small battlefield center, primarily based around the events of April 2nd, 1865, when the Union troops finally broke through the Confederate defenses. There's a number of artifacts, real, and displays inside here. But my centerpiece was this Don Triani painting depicting the breakthrough by Captain Charles Gould, said to be the first soldier over the Confederate lines. Now he was bayoneted right through the cheek and pounded by the defenders, but he survived, and he received a Medal of Honor for his bravery. And this original painting is titled Medal of Honor. At the display is also his Bible and revolver. Now in a long-shot way, I guess you could almost say he ended the war. Though there was a lot more involved, and nearly 7,800 casualties on this day. We then took a walk on the Breakthrough Trail to see the Confederate earthworks and the area where the breakthrough occurred. It's a beautiful wooded area now, a long way from its horrific past. On April 3rd, the Union Army marched into Petersburg, and Richmond was lost. So we returned to our hotel in Richmond. Dinner was on our own that night. I wasn't very hungry, so I settled on a very overpriced Subway sandwich and a half pint of Haagen-Dazs back at the hotel, which I got for free because the attendant couldn't figure out how to use the cash register. So I guess that balanced things out. And we had another good night's sleep. In the morning of our last day, we were on our way to Appomattox Courthouse with a few stops along the way. After the fall of Petersburg, Lee mustered up whatever army he could in an attempt to make it to North Carolina and find supplies for his troops. But General Grant was not going to let that happen, and he dispatched his army to hunt Lee down. So by now, Lee's army was a mess. They were tired, hungry, and disappearing every day. It's fair to say that they no longer felt the Confederacy could win, but they believed in Lee. Moving west along the Appomattox River, there were several battles that ultimately led to Lee's army being dissolved. We stopped at Sailors Creek State Park to learn about the battle that probably put the cap on it. April 6th, 1865 became known as Black Thursday among the Confederates. Lee lost roughly 1/4 of his army, most of which were captured. Lee would surrender 3 days later. The visitor center here was very nice, with a number of interactive displays and artifacts. There was also a lot of cool Civil War art here by Keith Rocco, Dale Gallon, and Sidney King. Remember John Cook's canteen we saw back in Gettysburg? Now there's an interesting story behind that, linked to Sailor's Creek. Sergeant John Cook of the 95th Pennsylvania Infantry was injured during battle, and he was taken to Burkefield Junction, where the injured awaited the train to take them to the hospital. There he laid on a platform for 3 days next to a Mississippi captain named Smith. John Cook shared what little water he had left in his canteen with him. On the 3rd day, when they heard of Lee's surrender, they both embraced and cried in each other's arms. Smith then passed away. There were no monuments surrounding the battlefield, just this one, but the park had a number of beautiful trails exploring the native landscape. After the battle, Grant reported to Lincoln, "If the thing is pressed, I think that Lee will surrender." And Lincoln replied, "Let the thing be pressed." Arriving in Appomattox, we stopped at the American Civil War Museum and had another great box lunch before exploring the museum. It used to be called the Confederate Civil War Museum, and though it is a museum of the Confederacy, it's nice to see that they changed the name to the American Museum. The museum is quite extensive, with a lot of artifacts and displays, generally centered on the Confederacy, its officers, and the men who fought for it. Now there's a lot of uniforms and swords on display, and once again, I was impressed with how ornate these objects were. Now, there was a rumor that General Lee and Grant met in an apple orchard at Appomattox, but it wasn't true. But after the surrender, soldiers, veterans, and relic hunters chopped up the trees as souvenirs, and there's a couple pieces of those trees here on display. Now, the big attraction here at the museum is General Lee's sword and death mask. It's a beautiful museum and an interesting look at what was known as the Lost Cause. We then went on to the Appomattox Courthouse, the last stop on our tour.
Grew up 2 days passed upon the march towards the Yankees and the front. I knew my trusty rifle, the difference was the hunt. We smashed into their backside up Loudoun County way. I'll not soon forget those boys in blue. I sent them to an early grave. On the road to Appomattox, where bullets whine like bees, cut the blossoms from the trees. On the road to Appomattox, turn boys into men, men into memories.
Appomattox Courthouse was actually a small village that grew up around the courthouse, known now as the surrender site. After the signing, many of the residents moved away, pretty much leaving things in an overgrown shamble. Occasional veterans, tourists, and artists would visit the area, so some of the locals would erect simple wooden signs and conduct tours, for a small fee, of course. The courthouse itself burned down in February of 1892. In 1893, a Union veteran named Myron Dunlap decided to dismantle the McLean House and exhibit it at the World's Fair in Chicago. Well, that never happened, and the disassembled house sat in piles for decades afterwards. Later in 1893, the War Department stepped in and erected 20 cast iron tablets. In this old photo, taken by the McLean House remains, you could see one of the iron tablets next to one of the wooden signs that the locals erected. The wooden sign says, "Don't move or carry away the bricks," as by now relic hunters started to carry off anything they could. It wasn't until 1933 when the National Park Service took over and the village of Appomattox Courthouse was restored to what we see today. We first stopped at the visitor center, which is in the restored courthouse. There was quite a lot to see here. I like the paintings of George Frankenstein, showing what the village used to look like before the war came to town. And here is Lulu McLean's rag doll, a silent witness to the surrender. It was taken by Union Captain Moore and carried off as a souvenir to his home in New York. 120 years later, it was returned to the National Park Service. And here it sits. And then there's this great mural of the surrender at Appomattox, painted by Tom Lovell. There are 14 buildings in the village. You can go in and explore a typical life in the 1860s. Meek's store was loaded with a lot of interesting household items. And scary medications. I've always been fascinated with the packaging of these products. And there are slave quarters, of course. And the Clover Hill Tavern. Lincoln had directed Grant to let him up easy, and he revived the payroll system whereby surrendered Confederate troops would have safe passage home. On the evening of April 10th, they set up printing presses here in the tavern and printed more than 30,000 parole documents nearly overnight. I took a walk to where General Joshua Chamberlain oversaw the laying of arms. The general ordered his men to salute their vanquished foes. Out here is the Pier's house, now a residence for the park employees. This is where the last shot was fired on the morning of April 4th. The howitzer that sits in front of the house was at the First Battle of Manassas in 1861. So I thought it was kind of a fitting close to our tour. We have come full circle. And of course there is the McLean house, where the surrender took place in William McLean's parlor. The furnishings here are not original, but are from that period. After the signing, everyone present started taking things from the home as souvenirs, or they were auctioned off. The two signing tables, Lee and Grant's, were the obvious take-home prize. Now there's an interesting story here. Is it true? Well, I like to think it is. After the fall of Petersburg, Confederate soldiers were deserting every day. One young boy ran off and stumbled into Union General Ord's campground one night. He was shivering in wet rags, hungry, and shaken with fatigue and in terror. When captured and questioned, he said he just wanted to get home. General Ord knew the feeling and had great empathy for the boy. He ordered his men to feed the boy, give him dry clothes, and send him safely on his way home. General Ord was present at the surrender. At the auction following the signing, he had his eye on Lee's table. But he only had $40, and it was going for much more. William McLean stopped the auction at that point and gave General Ord the table because the boy he had saved just a few nights earlier was his son. Ord then gave McLean the $40 that he had. Another great story. Eli Parker was a Native American Seneca Indian leader who was Grant's military secretary. He was present at the surrender and wrote up the surrender documents in his own hand because he apparently had great handwriting. When he handed them to Lee, Lee replied, "I'm glad to see one real American here." To which Parker replied, "We are all Americans, sir." We had one more stop to make before we headed back to our last night in Richmond. This was at a small Confederate cemetery. Buried here are 18 Confederate soldiers and 1 Union soldier, only 8 of whose names were known. There were approximately 300 casualties at Appomattox, ironically just hours before peace, and a chance to return home. Now there's a plaque here, placed by the United Daughters of the Confederacy as part of their Lost Cause campaign, and it is notably inaccurate. The National Park Service removed the line about Grant's 120,000 men. There were about 60,000 federal troops at Appomattox, and 28,000 Confederate soldiers had received their parole. We took our group shot here, and it was certainly one of the best groups I've traveled with. And a big thanks to Katie, our tour director, Kyle, our tour historian, and Hal, our driver, for great memories we won't soon forget.